So, governments have spent decades and billions trying to manage the plastic crisis. From complex recycling systems to waste management infrastructure, the efforts have been really massive. Yet, here we are in 2025 with plastic pollution still surging, and only 9% of the plastics that have ever made have been recycled. So, what went wrong? Why has plastic pollution become such a global crisis, demanding an international treaty that is being negotiated right now? Welcome to this special episode of the Climate Trends podcast. My name is Dharmesh Shah. I am the senior campaigner with the Center for International Environmental Law, and I've been following the plastics treaty for the past 2 years and following all the negotiations that have been ongoing between countries. In this episode, we will try to unpack why national policies have failed, the myth of recycling, and the lesser known but serious chemical risks tied to plastics. Because beyond what we see piling up in landfills and oceans, there is an invisible threat that's being ignored for far too long. So let's dive in. Today with me, I also have my colleague, Dr. Fatima Ahmad. Fatima and I met at INC 5.
Yes, thank you, Dharmesh. So, hi everyone. I'm Fatima from the Sunway Centre for Planetary Health based in Malaysia. And as Dharmesh said, we met at INC 5, and which is why we are having this whole conversation about plastics today. Thanks for having me, Dharmesh.
Thanks, Fatima. So, as I said, the governments haven't exactly been ignoring the plastic crisis. They've spent billions on waste management, recycling systems. But here we are again, still, plastics have been in the public domain as a material of use since the 1950s. And the consumption has only grown since then. But now it's become such a crisis and big human rights and environmental threat that we are discussing a global treaty. So, why did it become such a big crisis to the point that we're discussing that treaty? And what pushed this crisis to the global stage? Because we've had national policies in play for several decades now. Each country has its own way of dealing with the plastics crisis, but they've been failing in addressing the crisis. So governments have poured in money, as I said, billions of dollars have been put into waste management, and production keeps growing, and plastic waste keeps rising, and we're clearly not solving the problem. And recycling is certainly not coming to a rescue. And then there is the chemicals problem we hardly hear about, because this somehow has been we've been made to believe that plastics are inert and they pose no health to humans, human health, animal health, planetary health. So in fact, we made to believe that they're beneficial to health, because we saw that in the pandemic where plastic consumption went up, people started equating plastics with hygiene, which was certainly a misconception. So just want to start off by asking you, how much plastics are we exposed to in our daily lives, and why does this matter from a scientific and public health point of view?
So, the short answer is that plastics are everywhere, and it matters because we don't usually notice it. So, that's one of the main problems. Besides the usual suspects of like your, plastic water bottle or straw, single use plastic bag, we rarely think about where we find plastics. Your computer, laptop parts have it. Because it's such a good insulator, any wiring will have plastics around it, right? So anywhere and everywhere you'll find plastics, and even your clothes, right? There is plastic, and very few people will realize that some types of paints have plastic materials in them, because the idea of plastic is so much so that it's this single bulky material or a plastic bag, like a single stand alone. But even within that single stand alone plastic, there are like it could be multiple types of plastics within that one single product. So that's one of the issues. And there's been really good campaigns about plastics affecting marine life, choking marine life, and so on and so forth. But part of that campaign also brings in, I feel, this idea that plastics are going to last for a very very long time, like hundreds of years and so on, right? So that's kind of like the logic that's been said. It's not that it's untrue, but the problem is that the plastic can stay in the environment for a very long time, but not in the same exact, you know, form in which it was produced. So I'll give an example, like not a very good example, but hopefully will give a bit of like, like an idea of what I mean by the fact that it doesn't stay in the same way. So let's say we take a piece of candy, right? Hard candy, and you take a hammer and crush it, and then you keep crushing it until it becomes really, really, really tiny particles, right? And imagine you crush it in such a way that it becomes so tiny that you can't even see it. And this very tiny material can go into the water. If it's light enough, it can go into the air and so on. So the term microplastics might be familiar to some people as well.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, the idea is that the plastic is being, broken down into very, very, very small parts. So if you try to look at the tip of your hair, it's going to be very hard for you to like see the tip of your hair because it's so small, the diameter. Right now, imagine you quarter the size or make it even smaller. So all of this is there in the air. We don't notice it. Like I said, the clothing material that we have and so on and so forth, and and it's there. And the other problem is also that when you think about candy, the main material is sugar, right? But you also have colorants, right? And then you have flavorings. So where do these flavorings and colorants go, right? When you break these things down, some of them will go into the environment. So that's part of the problem with plastics as well. So they have additives inside the plastic too. So these chemicals, all of them, some of them you would or you may consider that it may not impact me as much, but there's more and more research coming out now saying that microplastics are causing disruptions to our metabolic, there's metabolic disorder, there is it's neurotoxic, it's an endocrine disruptor, which is basically saying that it impacts your ability to reproduce and so on. So and we are also accumulating microplastics in our body. It's not something that you very easily just flush out. There's research being done about just how much plastics we are accumulating our body. We're breathing it in, we are drinking it. I talked about the example of microplastics where the candy is being crushed. But besides the candy being crushed, there is also this idea of there is leaching happening. Part of the
Mm-hmm.
microplastics is going into your food, or some of the additives may go into the food as well. So there's a lot of research being done in this area. So that's kind of like the short of like as I was saying, the short part of it is that it's everywhere, but we are not noticing it enough. And from the science perspective as well, there's research coming out, and there's more research coming out, but there is still this pushback. I feel partly also because people are thinking about the fact that it's safe, because it's supposed to last forever, right? It's not going to do anything. So that's part of the issue that is there. But coming back to what I was saying about the campaigns, I'm not saying that stopping to stop single-use plastic campaigns and so on. Those are really, really important, and I'll share this story. This happened just last year, right? We would assume especially in city areas or where there's already regulation about single use, everyone will know about it. But I was at this shop. The cashier was immediately trying to get me a plastic bag right after I paid. And I'm like, it's okay, I have my own bag. And his immediate answer was, you don't have to pay for the plastic. And he gave me that look of like, why are you not taking the plastic, right? And that kind of like made me pause and realize that, the whatever campaign that we're doing, it's good, but it's still not enough. And people still need to know about the impact of plastics. So I'm gonna just pause there.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I just want to track back on point you made about the additives, and of course this is you're talking about once plastic becomes, a material from oil and gas and polymerization happens with the monomers. Now, all these additives are put in. So how, what about the manufacturing process upstream? Because this is, of
Yeah.
course, after you said it becomes microplastics, these things still remain part of the plastic, of the material, even after it's kind of disintegrated and become microplastics. But a lot of this exposure also happens upstream when manufacturing actually happens. Can you dwell a bit into that as well?
Okay, so I think one of the um, examples that I'll give is on volatile organic compounds. Now, before we go into that, for those who are like, who wants the the chemical names or whatever it is, um, plastics are polymers, although not all polymers are plastics. So the term polymer itself is saying that it's a single unit of something that's being repeated multiple times, right? So usually, if let's say you're purchasing something with a label and you see poly something, there is a possibility it's a type of synthetic plastic. There is a high
Mm,
likelihood. But that being said, not all plastic have this polymer name. For example, nylon, right? And then
mm,
polyester that you find in clothes, it's very obvious it's plastic, for example. But when it comes back to like coming back to VOC, right? So the term VOC is for volatile organic compounds, as I was saying, and the term volatile basically gives this impression of like it's not stable. But what's happening really is that at room temperature it evaporates, so which is why we call it volatile organic compounds. So you don't find it as a liquid at room temperature, you find it as a gas. Now you can imagine if it's a gas, it's going to be harder to contain compared to liquid, right? So if we have VOCs being released during the manufacturing process, you may end up with this VOCs being released into the environment. So that's one of the problems. And the thing about VOCs is that some of them are less dangerous than others. Some can be very, very dangerous. So again, the level of danger changes depending on what type of VOCs you're exposed to. That's one. And the other thing is that these VOCs are capable of forming ozone. And we're not talking about the ozone that's good, stratospheric, saves you from UV, but this is at ground level, and at ground level ozone is bad for health, right? So it's very, very dangerous for health. And the thing with ozone is that you don't notice when it's there. It doesn't have like this like pungent smell or like orangey color, whatever it is. So when you have VOCs, there's a high possibility that you're going to end up forming ozone, and that again is an impact to health, right? So there's been research, not much unfortunately, that but there has been research about workers being exposed to VOCs and
mhm.
ozone, and calculations where they try to measure how much ozone is going to be formed from these VOCs. And um, there was one study that was saying that after 5 years, there's going to be a significant impact to health, for example. So these are some of the things that we need to think about when it comes to like the manufacturing process, because synthetic plastics, a lot of them come from the petrochemicals, right? And
Yeah.
some of these petrochemicals, they might have a bit of like, you can smell them. For example, Damish,
Yes.
you can,
Yeah.
like
So
share your story.
yeah, it's funny that you mentioned about the smell thing, Fatima, because the the issue with VOCs is that, like, I've been to many of these petrochemical facilities in India and Thailand, other countries, and there's a distinct air pollution problem there, which is not like the visual particulate matter pollution, not dust pollution, but just bad smells of different kinds. And once you have an anchor industry, which is a big refinery, then you have a lot of downstream facilities, which is plastic manufacturing, or pesticides and fertilizers, which are all like downstream of the petrochemical plant. So the people that experience very distinct health problems, and the way they describe smells, so when you talk to communities, that they have associated those smells with everyday experiences in life. So you have rotten cabbage smell, for instance, which is an indication of hydrogen sulfide, or a nail polish smell, which is a indication of toluene or one of those aromatic VOCs, or benzene, for instance. So can you, like, I just found that your your views on the smells of VOCs very interesting, and how can you just dwell on that a bit more?
So I would say, like, I think it's good that some of the VOCs have smell, because then you would at least notice. But again, the problem with um, when it comes to industries and so on, people start to get used to it. Like, you just said it, like they're saying, it's like become everyday smell. They get used to it. That's the problem, and we shouldn't get used to it. But that being said, I also want to highlight that, not all the VOCs have strange smells. Some of them may not even have very specific smells that, and again, at very low concentrations, it might not even be noticeable, right? If it's noticeable enough, then you need to be very careful. And again, different VOCs have different health impacts, some more than the other. So that's another thing that we need to be very mindful about. For example, benzene is carcinogenic. It's basically a cancer-causing agent, and you would find benzene even at petrol stations, because it's an additive that you find in fuel, right? But coming back to plastics again, like, you have this problem of VOCs being released during manufacturing. And as I was saying, air is not that easy to contain compared to liquid or solid, right? And we even have this term fugitive emissions, like,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
are, they are criminals that we need to capture.
Yes.
And there are regulations, in certain countries where they say that, there's regulations on VOCs and so on. Like, you need to control the amount of VOCs that's being released, or try to reduce the amount of VOCs. If I'm not mistaken, there's also technologies in the manufacturing of plastics, where the plastics themselves are not going to release much VOC and so on. So technology is there, it's useful, but again, one of the issues is, one, enforcement, and second, like I said, air is not that easy to contain, which is why we have problems with fugitive emissions, for example. So that's one of the things that, like, I think people need to get used to this idea of, it's not just that plastic in front of you, but before it reaches you, um, what kind of exposure people around it or surrounding it, has been exposed to. And I'm talking about air because my field of expertise is more on air, but there's water pollution, soil
Hmm.
pollution, and so on. And another thing also is the other side of that life cycle, right? Once it gets thrown away, where does it go to? Like, does it break into small pieces, become microplastics, and so on? But also, in some cases, it gets burned, right? And which releases, again, like, this whole, slew of chemicals, including VOCs, for example. So there's a lot of, emissions if you look at that entire life cycle,
Hmm.
which is why
Hmm.
it's really important that, we think about, when we think about plastics, we need to think about the production, we need to think about during the life, the usage itself, and then at the end of that life cycle, like, where is it going and how it's going to be, managed, since it's already being produced. But
Hmm.
in an ideal world,
Yes.
you wouldn't want to have any plastics. It's good that we are having less and less uptake on single-use plastic. For example, there are alternatives, but the other types of plastics, there's still a long way to go. So yeah.
So yeah, so I mean, of course, the the diverse problems and the complex nature of plastics and plastics impacts on the life, on the lives and health of human beings. And you cannot, of course, we cannot talk about all of them now.
Yeah.
So we've only isolated a few of those to talk about today. One thing I wanted to also kind of wanted you to dwell on was microplastics, because that is a lot in the news now. We're hearing a lot about microplastics, but there's also this one particular, strand of, investigation that's happening by scientists on how microplastics act as vectors. Uh, and what does it really mean? Like, what does it mean when you say microplastics can be vectors for other chemicals?
So the simplest way to think about it is that it acts as a carrier of other chemicals or other biological things, for example, viruses perhaps. So if you come back to that example of the candy, right? If you leave that candy out long enough, it'll start to be sticky, right? And if you take small bits of paper and then you touch the paper to that candy, that paper is going to stick to the candy, right? So that's kind of like the idea of adsorption. So it's being, things stick to that little microplastic that you have. And this little microplastic, as it travels, it more and more things sticks to it. So there's been like research on this as well. There was one research that was mentioning, I think, about you would find about 6 times the amount of chemicals on microplastic surfaces compared to the surrounding water. This is if you look at like,
Wow.
a water body, right? So basically things are sticking to the microplastic. And again, like I said, some of these microplastics then get consumed by, marine species and so on. And we eat this marine species. So ultimately, again, it comes back to us, all of these chemicals, in addition to the plastic itself. So that's one of the issues again with microplastics, and it being a vector. So basically, the simplest way to think about a vector is that it acts like a carrier service, like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and and we've talked a little bit about why it's important, and I just want to touch back on the initial question you start off with, like governments need to look at this, and I would like to hear from your perspective about why have governments failed to address this crisis despite spending billions on like waste management.
Yeah, that's a very good question because I think from perspective of a policy geek, who's been trying to understand the policy landscape on waste for like almost 2 decades now, mostly working on national policies. The problem is that because we've been tackling the problem from the wrong end. Globally, if you look at just a quick back of the envelope calculation, and that governments have been spending, upward of like 10 to 20 billion each year on waste management alone. And this figure is only going to go up moving forward. This is mostly to collect, burn, and bury the waste. So which is like collection services, which is all our cities are growing, and we all have our collection waste collection mechanisms in place. All the cities across the world have been spending billions on transporting waste to landfills or to incinerators to either burn or bury the garbage. And countries that are rich enough are also exporting this plastic waste to countries like Malaysia and India. Both our countries are receiving garbage from the US and Europe, North America, Europe, Australia, all these countries, because they have the money to send it abroad. But less than 10% of the plastic that's ever been made has been recycled. And all this stuff that's ending up in our environment or in our incinerators and through the incinerators into the environment, the waste management approach is just trying to clean up a flood, where the tap is still running. So we're not turning off the tap. We're just trying to mop the water that is overflowing from the tub. So that's the analogy that is relevant here in the context of the policy making around plastic waste management, or waste management in general for that matter. What is missing is upstream action. We are not stopping the unnecessary plastic production. We are not banning toxic additives that you spoke about. We're not holding producers accountable for the amount of plastics and throwaway plastics that they've been putting out in the market. Um, and we've tried to manage our way out of this crisis, and it hasn't worked so far, unfortunately.
Why do you think like current laws don't treat plastics as a chemical hazard?
Yeah. So again, there I think, and looking at the evidence that you presented on how chemicals, how much there are 16,000 chemicals that are being used right now by the plastic manufacturers. These regulatory systems treat plastic as a waste issue and not as a chemical one. Again, so most plastics are made from fossil fuels and they contain thousands of additives that you spoke about. And many of them are toxic. They're persistent. They accumulate into the environment, into our bodies, into human and animal bodies, and they also magnify. From when we eat, for instance, a fish that consume that microplastic, the chemicals accumulate in those fish, and then it ends up in our bodies, and magnify. So our laws are right now typically focused on the visible and physical impacts. So the plastic bags you spoke about, the bottles, the pet bottles, the litter, garbage that we see in our oceans and our landfills, it's all been about controlling that visual part and the visible part of the garbage, of the plastic crisis problem. uh, the chemical dimension is sidelined, and which is a big problem. Chemical regulations uh, are not looking at plastics as a chemical problem. We have chemical regulations in many countries, but they're only limited to managing chemicals in the production phase. That too very weak. There's not a very they're not very strong laws in on chemicals, in the like national policies, for instance. So even though the science is clear about the hazards, the legal frameworks haven't caught up this far because of this fundamental problem.
So, I would like to hear your take on resistance from some governments who say that, existing treaties like the Basel
Yeah.
Convention already covers plastic issues. Because I think, again, it comes back to that, point you were talking about. The focus is on waste, right? But I would like to hear a bit more about what's your take on this.
Yeah, this has been a major issue with the in the negotiations also. A lot of countries have been saying, oh, we already have the Basel Convention, we have the Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Convention that already deals with a lot of these problems, and we don't need a plastics treaty. The problem with that, it's a very flawed argument, because the Basel Convention, let's look at each one of them. So the Basel Convention focuses on transboundary movement of hazardous waste. It was recently amended to include plastic waste, especially mixed or contaminated waste. So basically, countries like us, countries like Malaysia or India, they there was a amendment brought in to prevent the export of plastic waste or contaminated mixed waste to these countries. This was an important step, but it does not deal with the design phase of plastics. So, how the plastics are made, what chemicals are added to it, and how to prevent plastics from becoming toxic waste in the first place. So, in many ways, the Basel Convention is reactive; it's not preventive. And right now, with the Plastics Treaty, the whole effort in the Plastics Treaty, when we say a life cycle approach, is required, and this is like the main crux and the scope of the Plastics Treaty, is that plastics have crisis has to be handled from the life cycle perspective, which means it should not be dealt with once it becomes waste. It has to be prevented from becoming waste. How do you prevent that unless you bring laws that design or redesign plastics or the way the plastics are made? Then there is the Stockholm Convention. This covers what we call persistent organic pollutants, which you touched upon a bit. And these are like what they call POPs, And these are very, very toxic chemicals. And these are chemicals that persist in the environment for decades. They do not degrade. And they cause some of the most like severe human health and biodiversity harms known to mankind. Some of these pops have been found in plastics, are found in plastics, but they're just a tiny fraction of the thousands of chemicals used in the plastic production. As I said, there's 16,000, upward of 16,000 chemicals that have been identified. And most of the toxics in plastics, including endocrine disruptors, PFAS, what we call, the whole crisis in US around the PFAS, which was this chemical that was used on Teflon coating in our pans and pots. Flame retardants, which protect equipment from catching on fire, mostly found in our computers, etc. They fall outside the scope of the Stockholm Convention, and it does not address plastic as a material, only the worst chemicals used in some products. So that's the problem in Stockholm. And then there is Rotterdam again. which is all about informed consent on trade of certain hazardous chemicals. Again, relevant but very narrow. It doesn't stop the use of those chemicals. It just ensures countries know what they're importing. And many of these chemicals that used in plastics, as the plastic industry, is not even listed. So yes, the treaties that the countries are talking about, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention, these treaties are part of the chemical safety architecture, so to speak, but they're fragmented, they're outdated. None of them are. They address the plastic pollution as a life cycle issue, which is the main crux of the plastics treaty. So we need a dedicated plastics treaty, despite in spite of these three conventions. So I think I had just as I was speaking, at a question for you, like many of these chemicals, plastic chemicals, have been approved by regulators, but I mean, they allow these plastics to be used in manufacturing of plastic. I mean, these chemicals to be used in manufacturing of plastics. So, what's the problem from the pollution science standpoint? Why are these chemicals approved in the first place? From your point of view, been working with regulators as a scientist, what do you think?
I think from the science standpoint, I would like to pick on that. What you mentioned just now, that the scope is narrow. One issue is that as they go through, like, okay, this particular chemical, for example, is hazardous. We don't want it in food materials, for example, or this particular material, for now we have found it to be safe, kind of thing, right? So the problem with going one by one is that when you don't look at the whole family of chemicals that combine together, or have kind of like similar properties, then you are basically saying that until the chemical shows that it's hazardous, we're not going to do anything about it, and that's the problem. So I'll give an example of bisphenol A, right? So a lot of people who are buying water bottles would have noticed that right now, if you buy water bottles, the manufacturer will say free from BPA, right, which is bisphenol A, because it's been proven to be a endocrine disruptor. But the problem is that manufacturers are now resorting to bisphenol S and bisphenol F,
Mm.
right? But it's still bisphenol, but there's no research or proof that this F and S is safer, right? Until somebody comes in and says that, hey, it's not so safe, right? So that's why I was saying that from that pollution science perspective, right, we are not taking the precautionary principle. We are more of like that reactive of, okay, this particular one we know it's bad, so that one particular we strike it out, but anything that falls under that family is still open for debate or open for use. So that's kind of like the concern that's there.
So that goes into one just an additional question there, because there's a lot of conversation with the negotiations about substitutions, and here you have chemicals and alternatives also being discussed. So this is a very problematic approach. Like, if I have bisphenol A, which is toxic, then is bisphenol S less toxic? And what is the precaution that companies are using before they put this out, and what can regulators do for about it?
Yeah. So I think the problem now is that I don't think there's any specific regulation to track the impact. So that's one, I think, one of the major problems. So in terms of like from regulation, you are the policy person, you'll know better than me, right? But from my perspective, the fact that we are not tracking the impact is already saying that we don't care what's going to happen until somebody comes in and proves that this is bad. So that's kind of like, for me, the major issue with chemicals being approved or disapproved for use. So and also, like, in some cases, again, there's this narrow scope of, okay, you cannot use it for food, but you may be able to use it for others. I think that's a possibility too, as far as I know, right? So again, it's going to be there in the environment regardless, which is where the risk comes in. If you use it for food, obviously, if you already know it's bad and you use it for food, containers, for example, right? Then you know that, you are at a higher risk. But when you start using it for something else, or like I said, use something like within the same family without really figuring out whether that alternative is good, then it becomes a problem. In fact, there's a term for it. It's called regrettable substitution. So they have all these like
Yeah.
fancy terms and names and so on, but what's being done, that's the problem, right? Like there's
Yeah.
not much being done because there's a lot of pushback on, like, you know how do we stop production if we don't have alternatives, for example? So
Yeah.
people are working on alternatives, but then, this is more of like a question for you. Like when companies say our plastics are safe, right? What does that mean and what does it not mean?
Yeah, that's a very common thing, and it usually means no one has sued us yet. So that's what companies are saying. So legally, like speaking, safe means the chemicals didn't exceed a certain, they like all chemicals have to go through tests in the lab, and what it means is just generally that this particular chemical has met certain criteria or has a threshold in a lab test, and this assuming that the test wasn't designed by the manufacturer's cousin, because we've come across so many scams of companies having known what the impact of, I mean, known the harm that chemicals like BPA or PFAS have caused, but they have prevented that information from getting out in the public or even shared that with the regulators. And this is criminal, this is a criminal act, but they never get into trouble for that. But this is a very classic practice in the chemical industry. It does not mean that the when they say safe, it doesn't mean that it has been tested across the life cycle, and that it's safe for all populations and ecosystems. It does not mean that there is an absence of harm, which is a very important thing. And it creates that there is a for example, the baby bottles, for that is that became, then when I was talking about BPA, for instance, that's how the whole thing started, the BPA controversy. The baby bottle, plastic baby bottle might be safe because it doesn't leach certain chemicals above a threshold, but there is the fact that the BPA, uh, uh, the testing that they did on BPA, that did not reveal the uh, additive interactions, degradation that is caused by heat, for instance, or UV or long term exposures. All these things were not done. And so they just labeled BPA as safe and put it out in the market. So what it usually means is we haven't proven it's dangerous yet, and until you prove us wrong, it is safe. So that's the whole logic behind safety, unfortunately, and how it plays out in the current regulatory framework.
So in one way, what this is basically saying is that, this gaps, right, in
Hmm.
regulation. So what do you think are the biggest gaps in regulating petrochemical pollution, taking into account that synthetic plastics, come from petrochemicals?
Hmm. So one more point, I think, on petrochemicals, because as you said that, and I think when it comes to chemicals generally, and the safety thing, like looking at, for example, endocrine disruptors and how they interact with human body, and this is something that you can probably also reflect on as a scientist. But the endocrine disruptors don't follow like a a linear kind of, like it, the amount of dosage that goes into my body may not respond in the same way as a child's body. So during like small exposures to endocrine disruptors, which are very, very, this is a major problem with when it comes to plastics. during critical windows like pregnancy or child developmental years of a child can have serious effects. But the science that we have now still relies a lot on outdated risk assessment methods, that assume that a little bit of toxic, a little bit of poison is okay. Like, okay, this much is fine, the body will, like, excrete it. But that is a very kind of a very blinkered way of looking at chemicals and how they interact with bodies. And this ignores the cumulative impacts, which is when different kinds of chemicals go into your body, and the size of the body of the human body, the kind of vulnerability that person has, long term effects, mixture effects, which is synergistic effects of different chemicals which I mentioned. So the the issue that we have with chemicals and safety is that we are way behind in terms of regulations when it comes to addressing the dangers posed by these chemicals. And on petrochemicals, which is the made like the upstream of it, which is where all the plastics are made, the most regulations focus on end of pipe, as I mentioned earlier. Is once it becomes waste and litter and a disposal problem, the petrochemical facilities that manufacture these plastics, they emit massive amounts of air pollution, what you spoke about, the VOCs, water pollution, hazardous byproducts, 10 times more than what we actually seeing visually. The communities that live along these facilities, especially in the global south, in countries like mine, yours, many of the African countries, these are who bear the brunt of this problem. And there's virtually no global rules on toxic releases. uh, Countries have different varying ways of dealing with these emissions from these facilities. Occupation health for petrochemical workers, again, there's no standard laws on how to deal with this. Every country, depending on their national circumstances and capabilities, they come up with laws to address these problems. Life cycle impacts of plastic production are also not addressed. uh, Domestic laws in countries, a lot of countries, are often weak, they're poorly enforced, and they're subject to a lot of vested interests. So you have a lot of countries that are super poor, and there you have companies which are rich and they can buy their way through. And now this is documented. They have diluted laws, they've diluted regulations to ensure that they don't get into trouble for polluting. So that's the biggest blind spot in plastic regulation at this point, in terms of production and upstream.
Yeah, and I like that you pointed out, the co-exposure part. Like, there's this synergistic effect
Yeah,
happening, right?
yeah.
And also that age sensitivity, and what else are you exposed to? And all of that kind of brings in a bit of an uncertainty when it comes to, like, epidemiological studies, or
Hmm.
studies on, like, health impact and so on. So when it comes to treaty negotiations, like, how is this scientific uncertainty used to block action on
I
plastic pollution?
I can't begin to tell you that, like, this is such a classic delay tactic, and like we keep hearing we don't have enough data, so let's wait. And but like this, we've seen this playbook before, because I've, like, tried to investigate the industry tactics with tobacco, asbestos, lead, PFAS. With the whole, like, which is the most recent example of how industry uses the lack of scientific uncertainty as a delay tactic. They keep demanding perfect data while like sowing doubt about the existing evidence. With plastics and microplastics, there's tons of evidence already out there, and this is irrefutable evidence by very, very reputed scientists and scientific bodies and academics. But you still have countries demanding, of course backed by industry, that there's not enough data to link plastics and chemicals with human health. uh, with They keep saying that we need more research on microplastics or chemical toxicity. And then so that whole way of like working around like or keep raising concerns when there is no legal and scientific basis to actually prevent corrective actions from taking place. So that is the that's a major issue that we're facing in the plastics treaty negotiations. I'm glad you asked that because it is a fundamental issue actually.
Yeah, I kind of like saw it, as an observer in person, how it's being used as a delay tactic as well, right? And I
Yes.
think also another issue is the fact that, the language, or, how science is being done. So, in our conversation, I can use terms like, there's significant impact, for example,
Mm.
or, there is shown, results have shown. But when we read through like an actual, for example, scientific paper, right, so there will be, like, this is true up to this level of significance, for example, or, sometimes they wouldn't even use the term significant because it has a very specific statistical meaning, right? And but that's how science work, that's how the rigor of science work, and those within the scientific community understand that, this result is within this level of assumption, and we consider this, assumptions acceptable, and we are providing you with these results. But the problem is that when the non-scientific community comes in and tries to look through the resource, then it becomes like, okay, you are not sure about what you're saying about, but that's not really true, right? It's like
Yeah.
we know that, this applies within this and this, boundaries of this, test that we've done, or assumptions that's involved. And I think that's one of the things that needs to be brought into that conversation as well, as to like, how do we report back out scientific evidence, right? And I'm sure that can be like a separate conversation altogether. But coming back to the plastic treaty, right? What should a good global plastics like treaty actually do you think? And like, what are your kind of like red lines and must-haves?
Well, there are many red lines, but I'm saying if for me, if you're looking at a robust plastics treaty, uh, first and foremost, it should cap production because we're drowning in plastics and we're not craving more of it. No matter how much the industry might want us to think that we need plastics for survival on development, I don't think it's true for both of them. At this point, we need less plastics. We need to cap production of plastics. Second is address the toxic additives problem. Ban as many of these as possible because they are killing us. And no one has asked for endocrine disrupting glitter in their bloodstream, for instance. That's like so much out there. It's all in our bloodstreams. And PFAS is now found in every human being on the planet. So and an animal. So that that kind of infiltration of chemicals into our bodies is unprecedented in human history. So we need to address this issue of plastic of chemicals. And third, we need to make polluters pay. We need companies to be held accountable. They're raking in profits and unprecedented profits in the past decades, while the rest of us are like cleaning up the mess that they've left behind. So the the plastics treaty has to be bold, has to be and the negotiators have to be bold in making sure that at least these bare minimum red lines are not crossed. And we don't know what's going to happen in August, so we're waiting with a bated breath. We've had 5 rounds of negotiations so far over the past 2 years, and this additional session, or what we're calling resume session of the Busan round, because the Busan round did not conclude, so we've had to add an additional round of negotiation. So in August, we'll meet again in Geneva. And we're just hoping that countries have enough courage. Right at this point, there's enough ambition. There are 100 plus countries that are already seeking production cuts, regulation on toxic chemicals. So we have ambition in the room. It's just that we need to get those a small minority of countries that are blocking progress to come on board on the good side. So that's where we're at. We don't know what's in store, but we're hoping that good sense prevails and countries do the right thing.
So, I would love to like end this on a more positive note. Considering that we've been talking about, a bit of like, all the impacts, and pretty much, what's not working as well. But hopefully, like you said, good sense will prevail, and we need both incremental and transformational change. And transformational change is not going to happen until we look at the policy side, or from a governance perspective. And incremental change, for those listening in, is like, what can I do, right? So I think it comes back down to your personal choice, because I'm the generation that grew up seeing biscuits being sold in, tins, right? Like metallic tins. And then it became all plastic. And then I am now seeing this reduction in plastic again. But also as a child, I've never seen, a toothbrush made of, like where the handle is made of wood. But now I'm seeing it, because there is now this demand for, alternatives to plastic. So when there is, demand, the industry will also respond, right? So it's not that as a consumer, or, like as a layperson, there's nothing much you can do. I consider myself as a layperson, because I can do that research, but that research, being translated and being brought into a policy arena is a whole different process altogether, right? But everyday choices, do matter. But like I was saying, there's this need of transformational change, of like, this stop of, like, we need to stop turning on, leaving the tap on. Basically, it's not even turning on the tap, just leaving the
Mhm.
tap on. We need to, like, start shutting down the tap. And for that, we need a push of for policy. And any last words you feel like, on this, like, part that people can do on this push for policy, or what governments need to do?
Yes, yes. So and that just I mean, yes, I hear that a lot. And what can I do? And we've been doing, I mean, as good citizens, we've been doing what we can. Uh, and I think we need to hold two truths at the same time, at once. This is a personal choice, yes, issue. There's, yes, personal choices matter. Reducing plastic in your daily life, supporting reuse systems, asking questions of about what you're buying, reading the labels, making sure that your cosmetics don't have microplastics and added into it. These are meaningful, but on their own they won't solve the crisis. So the system is, at this point, is so rigged that the plastic they make plastics the default. So we have been basically been made to use as much plastics as possible. So we need to also push really hard for policy change, which is what we're doing. We need to demand of our governments the engagement in the plastics treaty. We have the biggest civil society turnout in the plastics treaty negotiations, which means that there is a lot of interest among people and citizens to see a policy change on a global level, and national level and local level. A lot of movements across the world have joined hands to make a change in how governments hold the plastic industry accountable, and how they address the plastic crisis, and support the global treaty that's meaningful. So we need rules that hold polluters accountable, that cap production, and that protect our health. So I think the we need to be honest at this point, that the crisis won't be fixed with just better recycling bins or biodegradable forks. We need transformational change. We need upstream actions, which you mentioned. Uh, we need a massive redesign of the system of consumption. Most of all, we need to confront the fossil economy that's behind it. It's behind the plastic crisis, and this change all won't happen at once. It happens when there's enough people demanding it. So I think, yes, carry your own bag, but also carry your voice, and have deeper conversations about the ecological crisis that we're facing at this point.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that I would like to add on is that most people don't realize that, when this kind of international negotiations are going on, usually the countries already come with a bottom line. They've already pretty
Yeah.
much decided on what they will accept or not accept. So the work where the voice comes in and pushing for government policy and so on comes much much earlier. So be a part of like communities or organizations perhaps that help push for these kind of things at the government level, at the local government level, at the national government level, so that when it actually comes to that negotiations, that bottom line is a bit different now. So I think that's something that most people are not aware of until they are part of that process, because the negotiations is not where they've already decided. Usually they've pretty much decided, okay, what we can and we're not going to accept, right? So that
Mhm.
voice matters, besides what you purchase matters.
Thank you so much, Fatima, for this amazing conversation today. I learned a lot, certainly, on the science. And of course, I mean, as I said, we could have covered a lot more because there's so many dimensions to plastic crisis. But what you shared today has been amazing.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing like your insights and perspectives from that policy side and what the governments want and so on. So that's been like really insightful as well. And hopefully, as we move forward, again, the voice and the personal choice do matter, right? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.